Lecture 10. The Cold War, Capitalism and Communism. On August 23, 1939, the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany. This was signed 8 days before Germany invaded Poland, resulting in World War II. Part of the pact included a relatively secret agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union and how to divide between themselves northeastern, southeastern, and eastern Europe. This agreement was not officially admitted by the Soviet Union until 1987, when Gorbachev referred to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact during a speech critical of Stalin's leadership. In 1989, Soviet leaders in Moscow confirmed that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact included a deal by which Germany and the Soviet Union divided up Eastern Europe between themselves. These public revelations contributed to the desire shared by Eastern European countries to be free from Soviet rule. Finally, in 1991, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist and many countries gained their freedom back. The brief history just explained is little known, especially since during the latter part of World War II, the Soviet Union fought on the side of the Allies. It did so after Germany broke its non-aggression pact by invading the Soviet Union in 1941. The following year, on January 1, 1942, the Soviet Union became a member of the Allies by signing the Declaration of the United Nations. The signers on the document included the United States, the United Kingdom, the USSR, China, Australia, Belgium, Canada, Costa Rica, and a number of other countries. Its aim was to defeat the Nazi-led Axis powers. After World War II ended, the true colors of the Soviet Union were revealed as it once again gained control of the countries it was to rule, according to the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany. Realizing this, in 1946, the Prime Minister of England, Winston Churchill, angrily denounced the USSR, and he stated, "From Stalin in the Stettin in the Baltic to the Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow." Winston Churchill's speech signaled the beginning of the Cold War that lasted up to 1991, when the Soviet Union was dissolved. It is called a Cold War to signify that the tension between the Soviet Union and the Western world, led by the USA, was hidden and not in the open. When wars were fought caused by this hidden tension, it was by proxy. For example, the Vietnam War, or conflict, can be understood as a proxy war between the Soviet Union and the United States. The proxy for the Soviets were the North Vietnamese, who were financially supported by the Soviets, and the proxy for the United States were the South Vietnamese, who received both financial and military support from the U.S. In this lecture, we will focus our attention on the Cold War by beginning first with Soviets' Marxist ideology. We will examine a number of events where tension peaked, including the Soviet blockade in Berlin, the Korean War, the Suez Crisis, the Yom Kippur War, the Berlin Crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, the Soviet War in Afghanistan, the drowning of a Korean airplane by the Soviets, and the Able Archer 83 military exercise program. This will be followed by a concluding section on the dissolution of the Soviet Empire in 1991. Marxism as a response to capitalism. Since historically Marxism was a response to capitalism, we will first examine how capitalism developed and took hold in much of the Western world before examining how Marxist communism took root in the East. The term capitalism comes from the Latin word caput, meaning head. The term capitalism originates from the Latin word caput, which means head, especially head of cattle. In ancient Rome, the first capitalist was, explains Florian Werner in his book, Cow, a Bovine Biography, and I quote, "someone who could call many heads his own, who in other words owned a large number of cows. In explaining communism and other ideologies in relationship to cows, the comedian Pat Paulson in 1968, during his campaign for the U.S. presidency, quipped this: "You have two cows. Communism. You have two cows, the government takes both and gives you some milk. Fascism. You have two cows, the government takes both and sells you the milk. Nazism. You have two cows, the government takes both and shoots you. Capitalism. You have two cows, you sell one and buy a bull." Why is capitalistic ideology linked to cows? This is because the owner can move the heads of cattle, move the cows at will. The key component of capitalism, consequently, is easy to move property that can take the form of capital, or in more modern times, financial investments that are digitally transferred in a millisecond. Another essential component of capitalism are self-interested businesses that own movable property for the purpose of making profit. A key element that allows businesses to flourish in a competitive environment is that the state does not set prices but rather allows the prices to be determined in the marketplace as businesses compete for customers. According to the Scotsman Adam Smith in his book The Wealth of Nations, written at the time capitalism was becoming a major ideology during the Industrial Revolution, political rulers should leave the economic marketplace alone since it is ruled by a self-regulating mechanism called the invisible hand. During the Industrial Revolution, some people became convinced that such an invisible hand, which Adam Smith, by the way, only refers to once in his writings, either does not exist, or if it does, is highly ineffective. Consequently, an ideology in reaction to capitalism developed called socialism, that, as its name indicates, believes that man is more social by nature than competitive. The earliest socialists came from France and England. The most famous of socialists, and not one of the earliest, was Karl Marx. Karl Marx, along with Friedrich Engels, disparagingly called the socialists that preceded them Utopian Socialists. Supposedly the earliest socialists were utopian since they had pious dreams and of ideal society but did not know how to actualize their dreams. In contrast, claimed Marx, in his scientific socialism, the dream of the early socialists could finally be implemented in a systematic, practical manner. His version of socialism is scientific since, Marx argued, he had discovered inevitable trends of history that once known can be sped up to its final destination point of communism, a kind of heaven on earth, where the state will wither away and the distinction of classes will cease to exist. The trends of history, explained Marx, in accordance with his materialistic version of Hegelian thought, are shaped in a dialectical manner characterized by thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The ultimate synthesis of history, where history as dialectic ends, is communism. Prior to communism, a political and economic system brings forth its antithesis, which is resolved in a synthesis that bears within it its own dialectical tension. For example, capitalism contains within itself the seeds of socialism that is at tension with capitalism. The tension between capitalism as the thesis and socialism as the antithesis is resolved in the synthesis of communism, which signals the end of history. The driving force or engine of the dialectical tension are new modes of production. A new mode of production, such as the invention of the steam engine or the creation of the internet, triggers the dialectical tension which is manifested in class conflict. Only at the end of history, as we experience it now, claimed Marx, will these tensions be resolved in a classless communist society. In order to cut down the time it takes to reach the perfect synthesis of communism, people who know the trends of history can direct the forces of history by working violently or non-violently to hasten the end of communism. In describing the earthly paradise of communism, which, by the way, there's absolutely no scientific proof that it awaits us, Marx wrote the following. He wanted to abolish property in land, an application of all rents of land to public purposes. 2, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. 3, abolition of all right of inheritance. 4, confiscation of property of all emigrants and rebels. 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. 6, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. 7, extension of factories and instruments of productions owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands and improvement of the soil generally in accordance with the common plan. 8, equal liability of all to labor, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. And 10, free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production. And you can find all of this in his Communist Manifesto. Inspired by Marx's description of the earthly paradise, heaven and earth, that supposedly would come, and by Marx's belief that once the trends of history are known, the time it takes to reach this end can be shortened, in 1917, Vladimir Lenin and his Bolsheviks plunged Russia into a civil war, which lasted from 1917 to 1922 and ended with the communist Bolsheviks emerging victorious. In 1922, Lenin officially established the Soviet Union. As described by Robert Service in Lenin, a biography, Lenin was convinced that the violent upheavals he was causing were justified since, and I quote, through Marx and Engels, he, Lenin, knew that the future would bring about a final and wonderful stage in world history. His life had purpose. Lenin clung to a rock of attitudes and assumptions, and on it he was able to construct almost any notions about politics and economics he wanted. End of quote. How could Lenin know the future? Can the scientific method as applied to politics give us certain scientific knowledge about the future? If it is claimed that science can predict the future with certainty, then does this mean that history is determined? If so, then how is it possible for anyone to hasten history to its end, since the ability to choose to hasten something to its end or not to implies the presence of free will? Free will, however, is not determined. After Lenin died in 1924, Joseph Stalin led the Soviet Union with even greater violence, all justified by the end he was supposedly hastening with his free will that, ultimately according to Marx's determinism, does not exist. This fundamental contradiction was a root cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. During the time the Soviet Union existed in its self-contradictory state, there were spikes of tension partly caused by its own inherent illogic. We will now briefly touch upon a few of the major ones of these spikes of tension that occurred during the Cold War era. The peaks of Cold War tension, Soviet blockade in Berlin. At the end of World War II, Germany was divided into 4 zones, a U.S. zone, a British zone, a French zone, and a Soviet zone. The capital of Germany, Berlin, located within the Soviet zone, was similarly divided into 4 sections. 3 of Berlin's 4 sections were ruled by the Western powers of the U.S., Britain, and France. The remaining section, located in the eastern portion of Berlin, was ruled by the Soviet Union. With the hope of ending Western rule in the 3 Western-controlled sections of Berlin, in 1948 the Soviet Union prevented the U.S. and its allies from delivering goods, food, fuel, medical supplies, etc., to the approximately 2 million Germans living in the Western-controlled section of Berlin. Railways, highways, and canals by which fuel, food, and other vital supplies arrived in West Berlin were all blocked by the Soviets. The Soviets also ended much of the electrical power that West Berlin relied upon. The US and Britain responded by flying airplanes to daily deliver supplies to the Germans. The Soviets responded with low levels of harassment, such as flying fighter jets close to cargo planes and by shining bright lights into the Western airplanes' cockpits. During the blockade, it seemed possible that a third world war of Western powers against the Soviet Union could occur. Some officials in the Western countries even entertained the idea of sending in tanks into the Soviet zone of Germany in order to force the Soviets to open up the highways, canals, and railways. Fortunately, on May 12, 1949, the Soviet Union ended the harassment and lifted its blockade. The Korean War. From August 22, 1910, when the Korean Emperor surrendered his rule to Japan, to the remaining days of World War II, Japan governed Korea. In August of 1945, near the end of World War II, the Soviet Union entered into a war with Japan and gained control of the northern section of Korea up to the 38th parallel, which divides Korea in half. Meanwhile, the U.S. was occupying southern Korea. The government that formed in the north was modeled on the Soviet system of governance, while the southern government was modeled on the U.S. system of governance. Tension between these two Koreas, each claiming to be the only legitimate Korea, erupted into a war on June 25, 1950, when Soviet and Chinese-backed North Korean troops invaded South Korea. With the backing of the United Nations Security Council, the U.S. led and launched a counterattack. On July 27, 1953, the war ended by an armistice, according to which Korea was divided into northern, communist-controlled nation and a southern democratic nation. The casualties of the UN troops, predominantly U.S., were 142,000, and the casualties of the Koreans was at minimum 1 million. Suez Crisis and the Yom Kippur War. On May 14, 1948, the same day that the British Mandate of Palestine officially ended, the State of Israel declared its existence. That day, in establishing the Jewish state, David Ben-Gurion read from the Scroll of Independence, I quote, "By virtue of our national intrinsic right and on the strength of the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly, we hereby declare the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, which shall be known as the State of Israel." End of quote. The very next day, armies from the surrounding Arab nations invaded Israel in a coordinated attack. The invading nations included Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. The Arab-Israeli War ended in the beginning of 1949 as armistices between Israel and its Arab neighbors were signed under the supervision of the UN negotiator and U.S. citizen Ralph Bunche. For his peacekeeping efforts, Bunche was awarded a Nobel Prize in 1950. During the conflict, the United States attempted to play a neutral role in order not to allow Middle East unrest to disrupt the balance of power of the Cold War that could lead to a Third World War. This balance of power between the Soviet Union and the USA came close to being gravely disturbed when Israel, backed by the Western powers of Britain and France, invaded Egypt in 1956 in order to gain control of the Suez Canal. Believing that it was in their mutual interest, the United States and the Soviet Union both wisely insisted that Israel withdraw its forces from Egypt. Israel complied. During the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, the Soviet Union and the United States did not collaborate together in order to avoid Cold War tensions from escalating. In this war, the Soviets sided with the Arab nations by supplying them with arms, while the United States allied itself with Israel. The war was initiated by a coalition of Arab states headed by Egypt and Syria, and began on the holiest day of the Jewish year, Yom Kippur, also known as the Day of Atonement. Fortunately, this war lasted less than a month, when on October 25th the United Nations convinced the two sides to end the war. Berlin Crisis. On June 4th of 1961, the Soviet Union threatened the Cold War bipolar balance of power by requiring an ultimatum that Western nations remove their military forces from West Berlin. The West was given 6 months to comply. The U.S., Britain, and France, though, refused to comply. After 3 years of intense negotiations, the Soviets in 1961 responded by building a well-guarded wall to separate East Berlin from West Berlin. Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1902, the former Spanish colony of Cuba gained its independence from U.S. occupation. From 1902 to 1958, Cuba was ruled by pro-U.S. leaders. The final pro-U.S. leader was General Batista. Batista served as Cuba's president from 1940 to 1944 and from 1952 to 1958. In 1958, Fidel Castro, who favored the Soviet Union, successfully overthrew the Batista regime. The United States CIA reacted by secretly planning to overthrow Fidel Castro in April of 1961. This failed invasion of Cuba is called the Bay of Pigs. In October of 1962, Cuba once again became the epicenter of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. The tension appeared to come close to the brink of nuclear war. Prior to 1962, the Soviet Union had secretly built silos on Cuba to house and launch missiles from, and had sent 42,000 armed Soviet soldiers to the island. Since the Caribbean island country of Cuba is a little under 100 miles from the U.S. coast, this posed a grave threat to U.S. security. When the U.S. Air Force conclusively confirmed that these missile facilities had been built in Cuba in order to receive the Soviets' missiles, Cold War tensions escalated dramatically. To prevent the missiles from being delivered by the Soviets, the U.S. Navy blockaded Cuba's ports. The U.S. also insisted that missiles already in Cuba be returned to the Soviet Union and asserted the U.S. will prevent any further missiles from being delivered to Cuba. Finally, on November 21, 1962, the U.S. President John F. Kennedy ended the blockade around Cuba after the Soviet Union agreed to reclaim their missiles deployed on Cuba. President Kennedy also promised the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev that the U.S. would never again secretly invade Cuba. Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, sometimes also referred to as the Vietnam conflict, between the North Vietnamese and South Vietnamese, is an example of a proxy war of the Cold War era. Through the North Vietnamese, the Soviet Union fought against the U.S., which was supporting the South Vietnamese. The U.S. aided the South in order to prevent communism from spreading and to contain the influence of the Soviet Union in accordance with the Truman Doctrine of Containment that was established partly in reaction to the Greek Civil War between communists and anti-communists. In 1975, North Vietnam successfully defeated South Vietnam and began unifying the country under one communist government. War in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan lasted from 1979 to 1989, fought by the Soviet Union against U.S.-backed Afghan forces, is similar to the U.S. and Soviet involvement in the Vietnamese War between South Vietnam and North Vietnam. In 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan to install a pro-Soviet regime. To keep Soviet influences contained, the U.S., under the leadership of President Reagan, armed and financially backed Afghan anti-Soviet forces called the Afghan Mujahideen. The now infamous wealthy Saudi and co-founder of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, worked with the CIA as a financier who distributed U.S. funds to the Afghan Mujahideen. According to the CIA officer Milt Bearden, who is stationed at the CIA presence in Islamabad, and I quote, "Actually, bin Laden did some very good things. He put a lot of money in a lot of right places in Afghanistan." End of quote. In 1989, the U.S.-backed Afghan forces successfully caused the Soviets to withdraw from Afghanistan in defeat. During the Afghan War, two incidents even further heightened Cold War friction between the U.S. and the Soviet Union that could have sparked an all-out war. On September 1, 1983, a South Korean airplane was flying from North New York City to Seoul. Evidence indicates that a Soviet missile shot it down over the Sea of Japan. All the 269 crew members and passengers died. Another incident that also occurred in 1983 is the Able Archer 83 military exercise that NATO began. The exercise was interpreted by the Soviet Union as being an actual preparation for war. The Soviets responded by preparing for a nuclear war. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. During the Soviets' Afghan War, the Soviet Union's economy was performing poorly. Due to the mystery of human freedom, it is not possible to clearly and distinctly determine what caused the Soviet economy to fail. There is some evidence, though, that the Soviet planned economy was doomed to fail from the very beginning when it was established in 1922. Due to differences of particular cases, which can vary substantially from one location to another and one time to another, it is not possible for a government to determine prices of goods that adequately balances the supply of the good with the demand of the good. Also, this centralized system of price control effectively eliminates a profit incentive of companies and employers to produce. Another reason that explains the Soviet Union's economic collapse was its inflexible system of governance, resistance to change and reform, and the Soviet Union's high military expenses. The latter one, the Soviet Union's high military expenses, may have been the most significant factor for the breakup of the Soviet system. This is particularly evident in the Soviet-Afghan War. The amount of money it cost for the Soviets to fund this failed war may have put their entire economic system in jeopardy. Not surprisingly, a few years after the war ended, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. The end of the Soviet Union came under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev did not think that the highly centralized system of the Soviet Union over a vast amount of territory could survive. In 1991, the Soviet Union was dissolved and Boris Yeltsin was elected as the president of the new Russian Republic, bringing an end to the Cold War. God bless.